Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending where in the world you are. I'm Lisa Berkely, in for Marilyn Turkovich for the Global Reads for the Charter for Compassion. And just a little bit of housekeeping before we get going. If you are watching this live and you want to get involved in this conversation, you can feel free to hover down at the bottom of your screen where you'll see a question and answer or a space for chat. Feel free to submit your questions or comments, and we will respond to them as best we can. Also, if you have any technological challenges and you go to zoom.us, the Zoom platform people will be delighted to help you. Before we get into this call, our book today, just a little bit heads up too that you are, if you have not read the book, that's okay. You can still listen and participate in the conversation. It's an open time with just ease and grace. So today we're going to be beginning our conversation on a wonderful book called The Internationalists. And it is written by Oona Hathaway and Scott Shapiro, and I'm going to just give you a little bit of background about them, and then we're going to jump into the conversation. I did want to also mention, if you hadn't caught it by now, that we are with the Charter for Compassion, and we are the catalyst, we could say, for the Compassionate Cities movement. And we are in over 400 cities around the globe in 53 countries. So your support of our work is greatly appreciated. And you can learn more about us by going to the charterforcompassion.org website to learn more about our organization and also about the Global Reads program. Without further ado, let's jump into this, and let me tell you about Oona. Oona A. Hathaway is the Gerard C. and Bernice Latrobe Smith Professor of International Law and Counselor to the Dean at Yale Law School. She is also Professor of International Law and Area Studies at the Yale University Macmillan Center, on the faculty at Jackson Institute for International Affairs, and Professor of the Law University Department of Political Science. She's a member of the Advisory Committee on International Law for the Legal Advisor at the United States Department of State. In 2014 to 15, she took leave from Yale to serve as special counsel to the General Counsel for National Security Law at the U.S. Department of Defense, where she was awarded the Office of the Secretary of Defense Award for Excellence. Professor Hathaway earned her BA summa cum laude at Harvard University in 1994 and her JD at Yale Law School, where she was editor-in-chief of the Yale Law School in 1997. She served as the law clerk for Justice Sandra Day O'Connor and for D.C. Circuit Judge Patricia Wald. She's a principal investigator on a grant awarded by the Hewlett Foundation to study cyber conflict, and she has published more than 25 law review articles and is the co-author of The Internationalists, how a radical plan to outlaw war remade the world. And of course, that is with her co-author, Scott Shapiro. And Scott is the Charles F. Southmid Professor of Law and Professor of Philosophy at Yale Law School. His areas of interest include legal philosophy, international law, constitutional law and theory, criminal law, family law, and cybersecurity. He is the author of the 2011 published Legality and editor of the Oxford Handbook of Jurisprudence and Philosophy of Law, which was in 2002. He's also the editor of the Journal of Legal Theory and the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. He earned his BA and PhD degrees in philosophy from Columbia University and his JD from Yale Law School. And without further ado, we're going to jump into the conversation about this phenomenally exciting book, The Internationalists. And why I say it's exciting is because I think it really sets the platform for the Compassionate City movement in many ways. So Oona and Scott, if you want to just take a little bit and tell us about the book.
I'll begin, but first of all, let me just say thank you so much for having us. It's really great to be able to participate in this incredible organization that you've all put together. So thank you. So our book is about the origins of the modern international order, about the people who helped to build it, and why despite its imperfections, it's crucial that it be defended now more than ever. And the central argument of the book is that the origins of the modern world order can be traced to a specific date in history, August 27th, 1928, when the leaders of the great nations assembled in Paris to outlaw war. Now, the treaty signed on that date, which is often called the Kellogg-Briand Pact, after Frank Kellogg, the United States Secretary of State, and Aristide Briand, the French foreign minister, has either been forgotten or been treated as a laughingstock. And to tell you the truth, when Oona and I taught international law together at Yale, we also treated it that way. It just seemed just crazy that you could hope to end war through a piece of paper. But really, in the course of our research on a different topic, on the history of economic sanctions, we discovered something that we really didn't expect. That is, far from being ridiculous, the pact was transformative. It was like a hinge in history where one world order ended and another one began. Before 1928, in short, war was a legitimate tool of statecraft, the way in which states enforced their rights against one another. And indeed, to our incredible astonishment, we discovered that not only was war legal, but economic sanctions used to be illegal. After 1928, war became illegitimate, indeed criminal, and now economic sanctions are the standard way in which international law is enforced the world over. Now, we describe this really incredible shift in the meaning of war narratively through a cast of characters that we call the Internationalists, who played a crucial role in the outlawry of war. And some of these people we, kind of heard of, but most have been completely forgotten. Most of the people we had never heard of. But we were really taken with their brilliance, with their imagination, their determination, their canniness, and being able to figure out how to take their ideas and translate them into action. So though the book describes a massive revolution in the way in which the world works, it's really a group biography. It's really a story of how individuals came together and were able, against very long odds, to change the world.
Right. Oona, do you wanna add to that?
Well, I'd say that as we delved into the book, what we were surprised and excited about was the cast of characters that we discovered. As Scott said, there are a bunch of people, the Internationalists, that the book is named after, who many of whom we had never heard of, most people had never heard of, whose lives were incredibly interesting, whose conviction was really powerful. Just to give one example, Salmon Levinson was a bankruptcy lawyer in Chicago who had never really had anything to do with international law in any way, shape, or form. He didn't hold any formal position, but as World War I descended and he had 2 fighting age sons, he desperately was trying to find a way to avoid war. And he got this idea that the best way to end war was to outlaw war. And he really becomes the hero of our story because he has this idea that just seems completely outlandish. That is, let's outlaw war. That seems like a kind of crazy idea. And it's sort of an idea that someone who hadn't really had anything to do with international politics before could have had, because he was willing to pursue this pretty outlandish thought. And he starts writing about it. He connects with colleagues and friends around the country, including John Dewey, who was one of the great public intellectuals of the time. He works with peace movements around the country, particularly the women's peace movement, which was so active at the time in Chicago, which is where he was. He founds his own non-governmental organization, the American Committee for the Outlawry of War, to spread the idea of outlawing war. He works with politicians in Washington to try and get the idea into law. And he really is in many ways the hero of the story here for us, because he has this idea that he just pursues relentlessly. And over the course of a decade, it goes from kind of outrageous to law. By 1928, it is signed by nearly every nation in the world. It's the most ratified treaty of any treaty in the world in 1929. And we argue it really is important in precipitating a major shift in the way that the international legal order works. And all began with this guy, Salmon Levinson, who really had, no formal role. So that's part of what's so fascinating about the story to us.
Mm-hmm. So when you speak about the internationalists, and again, I'm going to, some of my questions may be a little bit broad because we may have people who are participating who have not yet read the book. So I will say one of the things that attracted me to it, and I would love to hear your feedback on this, was that it really, you speak about the difference of an internationalist versus the interventionists. And the internationalists, it seems that care and compassion well, yeah, we'll say care and compassion are really the underlying principles for a lot of their work. Does that speak to you? I mean, can you say more about that?
Okay. I can say something, and Oona can jump in. So, certainly, the idea of suffering was foremost on their mind. This Salmon Levinson comes up with this idea in 1917. He writes the article in 1918, right after this global cataclysm of the First World War. And there is a sense, the burning sense that he has, that this is just war is an incredibly foolish, cruel way to resolve conflict. The interventionists, who we trace from the early 17th century to the so-called father of international law, Hugo Grotius, their idea was that war had to be legitimate because there had to be a way in which states could resolve their conflicts when there was no court to go to. If we're harmed, if we're wronged, we can go to the police, we can go to courts, but states have no place to go to because there's no Supreme Court of the world. And the internationalists thought, well, on the one hand, we can see why that's there's a reason to go to war, that is because you've been wronged. On the other hand, there are so many more reasons not to go to war. And the degree of suffering that war creates and the degree of disruption in people's lives, and particularly the lives of civilians, was for them a reason to say, hey, no more, we're not going to do this anymore. And how do we reconstruct the global order, the way in which states behave with one another in a more compassionate, rational manner?
Do you want to add anything, Oona? Or?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I mean, the individual characters, I mean, we in the book, we try to tell their story and give a sense of what motivated each of them. I mean, what's interesting is that the interventionists were doing what they thought was right too. I mean, we try to look at them, and understand their motivation and understand why they thought that, pursuing that war was an essential way in which states would resolve their disputes. And that was, so the book tries to view both the interventionists and the internationalists where they are and understand their motivations. We side with the internationalists in the end because we think that they're right, that you can construct a global legal order without resorting to war, and that we argue that they were successful in creating a set of legal rules that made possible a international legal order where we've seen many fewer international wars than we did before 1928, that the number of people killed in war has fallen precipitously, that we've constructed a global legal order where states enforce the rules through sanctions and through diplomatic means rather than through war. And that's a much better world to live in. but it's also important to recognize and understand why the people who are arguing on the other side were arguing on the other side, and what their commitments were, and why they thought that it wasn't that they were evil, and it was just that they were trying to solve a certain set of problems, and they thought the way to solve them was that war was essential to solving those problems. Mm-hmm. And in many cases, they were craven. You know, they were not always good people, but nor were the people on the side of the internationalists. And when we tell the story of Frank Kellogg, who is the U.S. Secretary of State, after whom the Kellogg-Briand Pact is named, not a particularly nice guy, it turns out. He's you know, swears a lot, and he's kind of mean to the people who work for him, and he kind of takes credit for the idea, which it wasn't really his, and he kind of pushed against. So they're real people, you know, they're real people with both the good and the bad that implies.
Mm-hmm. It just shows us the complexity of human nature, and then the choices that we make. And it, you know, a lot of times in the compassionate movements, we talk about, you know, a compassionate city being an uncomfortable city. And it's uncomfortable because it's facing the hardships in the face and saying, how are we going to collectively solve this? So it's really acknowledging the gifts and the challenges that we have as individuals and as a society. So I very much appreciated that component of it wasn't just sort of whitewashing it, that this is all peace and love and kumbaya singing. Before we go further down this kind of conversation, though, I'm curious because you mentioned that the internationalists weren't really discussed in your law school education, and so I find that very intriguing. How did you get into this topic? I mean, it's kind of a very exciting and direction to go. But how did you go there?
Yeah, so we started working together because we were interested in the question of, you know, is international law really law? And if it's really law, one of the main critiques people make against international law really being law is they say, well, it's never enforced. You know, you never see international law. It's just sort of goes unenforced. It's really just morality. It's not law. And so we started thinking together, well, that's not true. One of the major ways in which international law is enforced today is through economic sanctions. It's also enforced through states entering into global agreements that give them benefits. They give benefits to one another, and then if states behave badly, they're excluded from the benefits of that agreement. So the World Trade Organization gives everybody access to lower trade barriers. If you break the rules, then you can be denied some of the benefits of being a member of the World Trade Organization. So we started thinking about this, and then we realized after we had written an article together about this, that we had been assuming that that it wasn't possible for states to enforce international law with war. We had just sort of been assuming that. Now, of course, in the modern era, it would be crazy to enforce international law with war. But we realized, well, maybe it hasn't always been the case that international law is enforced the way it's enforced today through economic sanctions. When did that start? Mm-hmm. And what existed before that? How was international law enforced before the main way in which it was enforced was through sanctions? So we started tracing this back, and we realized that it was actually pretty recent that this change happened, that economic sanctions, as Scott said, were illegal up until the late 1920s. And war, on the other hand, was perfectly legal. And so that got us really curious. What happened to change that? Why did that transform? What were the old rules that existed? And why did they flip at this moment, which is earlier than most people think the modern international legal order took shape, which is in 1945. And we were seeing that something important had changed in the late 1920s and early 1930s, which was a lot earlier than most people thought. So that's what got us looking at this period and trying to figure out what had changed and how did it change and who was responsible for that change. And that's what led us to the Internationalists.
Scott, did you want to add anything?
I just to say that in some weird way, so you ask an excellent question, which is like, in some sense, why have why has history forgotten about these people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And bizarrely, it's that they've been a victim of their own success. That is, that it's precisely because the world has changed so completely as a result of their efforts that we find it very hard to remember what the world was like before them. So we always imagine it was always that way. But in fact, it hasn't been. And I mean, we can talk about this later, but I mean, part of the message of the book is not just to say, oh, look, the world used to be really weird, and we live in a much better world. That's, you know, part of the story, but another part of the story is the world used to be very different, and it could change for the worse again.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not like there's only one way the world can be. Actually, there's other ways the world can be, and it used to be in a way in which was particularly cruel, brutal, and unjust, and that we can go back to that system if we're not careful. Also, that we shouldn't rest on whatever achievements were made, but we need to create additional mechanisms, institutions, organizations like the Charter, which helps further a world in which war is considered to be barbaric.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's interesting as you're talking about assumptions. You know, I'm also thinking, I mean, it's a totally different realm than international. But again, when you think about our society is made up of individuals, right? So parenting techniques are different. Also, you know, we less punish children with, you know, the stick and more have timeouts, right? And so I'm thinking, because I was thinking about this difference of war versus sanctions, you know, go take your time out and get it together, right? And just how we build our society and the underlying assumptions. And here we are in today's world where certainly in the US, we have some challenges. Some might say that we have a child acting out, running our government, but I wouldn't necessarily we could make a good case for that. And so I'm half serious and half joking, and no disrespect for our administration meant, but I do look at, so when we're in today's world, we seem to be on this real interesting precipice of where are we going. And so through your lenses, with all of your exploration and research on interventionist mentality versus internationalist mentality, do you see a correlation here of some sort of precipice or interest?
We definitely do. And in fact, we end the book talking a little bit about exactly this problem. And we finished the book right after the election. So we aren't able to talk about everything that's happened in the last several months, but that has just sort of heightened the concern that we raised at the end of the book, that the fact that we live in this world where war is illegal, and where we resolve our disputes peacefully, and that states are not permitted to use force against one another except in self-defense or as authorized by the Security Council, is a fragile state. It is not the case that it's guaranteed that it will always be this way. And part of the story that we tell is to show, well, it wasn't that way for a really long time. States could use war against one another to resolve their disputes. And it was the work of the internationalists that really changed that. And that's a really precious thing to have and not something to put at risk. And there definitely have been some moves in recent months that do put that commitment at risk in the United States, but also around the world. Even before the election, of course, Russia's seizure of Crimea, very dangerous, because that is the first successful conquest in Europe since World War II. And now the world responded to that with economic sanctions and refused to recognize the legality of that conquest. There have been moments at which it seemed like the Trump administration wanted to cut back on the sanctions against Russia. And that would have been a real problem because that would have signaled an acceptance of the illegal conquest and would have been a green light to maybe doing more things like that. Also, the Trump administration has shown its own willingness to use force in ways that are not legal and we think ill-advised. So has used force in Syria against the Assad regime in retaliation for chemical weapons strikes and in retaliation for strikes against Syrian defensive forces. So, neither of which are legal under modern international law, and they haven't even bothered to try and justify them or explain those strikes. So, and the U.S. has threatened to use force against North Korea, the so-called, bloody nose strike against North Korea, which would be really unprecedented and very dangerous because it could launch us on a path towards massive war, not only with North Korea, but potentially bring us into direct conflict with China. So there's a lot of reasons to be worried today. China also, meanwhile, has been building on contested territory in the South China Sea. So there are many states that are kind of testing the waters, that are kind of pushing the edge and seeing if the rules are still going to be maintained and observed. And traditionally, the United States has been a state that has really policed the legal order, has played an important role in pushing back against states that want to break the rules. And so it's worrisome that there's signs that we might be willing to kind of be pulling back on some of that, and that we may even ourselves be willing to take some actions that are very hard to defend. And so part of the message of the book is we ought to be concerned about that. And that many of the things that we really value and care deeply about depend on the prohibition on war and depend on it being observed. And any steps that are taken to undermine it potentially put the legal system at risk. And we think that's very dangerous. And I like your cat in the background there.
First, I have to apologize. I thought my door was closed and I'm just hearing books flying in the background.
Your cat has excellent taste. If I could just add one thing. So Oona mentioned that we finished this right after the election, which of course the election came as a total surprise to us, as it did to so many. I want to say that the book is not a partisan book.
No.
That is, it's not an argument against Republicans. It's a kind of, we kind of see sin, pox on both the houses. We did think our target in the book was going to be a Hillary Clinton administration that was overly hawkish against liberal interventionists, people in our own camp who we thought didn't get it, who were willing to resort to war if it was overseas, and so this is the attraction of war is neither a left nor a right problem. It is a kind of a post-partisan problem, and so we think we aim to be speaking not just to Republicans in the Trump administration, but also to fellow travelers on the left and Democrats who don't seem to be as bothered as we are by the readiness of the United States to use war.
Right. I think you make a very excellent point. As far as, I think when we get afraid, we can act out and maybe not think long term, and some people's automatic response is to go into fight or flight kind of mode, and so I think nonpartisan is a very relevant thing because we're facing really global issues now. And this is a lot of what I appreciated about your book, is that to your point earlier, Oona, the characters in this book are so, they're dynamic, they're rich, and they're very courageous, actually, because it takes a lot to go against mainstream. And I think too that, and as we spoke about in our pre-call discussion on this, the gift of what's happening in the world today is it is waking up a lot of people to say there's got to be another way, and we don't want war. And I think the internationalists laid kind of a foundation in our consciousness, to your point, like, oh, we don't have to do this. And that's also, I think, where the compassionate movement steps into. It's sort of like the as I said to you before, it's like the 2.0 internationalist version. So I guess the next question would be more about, so when we're looking at today's world and looking forward, how do you, how do you feel people can, what can we learn from the internationalists, from these amazing people, so to move forward, is to stay on that track rather than an interventionist and fear-based track?
Yeah, I'll say a few things along those lines. I think one thing that's important is, the internationalists are not the sort of famous people. They weren't necessarily in positions, obvious positions of power.
Right.
Salmon Levinson, a kind of ordinary guy. Sumner Wells, an undersecretary of state. Yes, he was working for government, but it was a relatively low-level position. James T. Shotwell, a medieval historian. I mean, these are fairly, and Herschel Atterpach, a kind of British academic. These are not people who are sort of, it's not the secretaries of state. It's not the presidents that were really the ones that were motivating this transformation. They had to get behind it in the end for it to work, but it was really ordinary people and who made a big difference. And so I think the first message is, I think a lot of people tend to despair because they figure, well, people in power don't really understand, and they're never really going to understand. I'm not in a powerful position, so there's no point in trying to do anything. And part of the message of the book is, like, you don't have to be in the position of power to make a difference. If you have powerful ideas and you work hard for them, that can make a real difference in the world. And I think that's an important message for people to hear, because it can be very, can be easy to despair otherwise. I think the other key message is that the argument that we make in the book is that the commitment to outlaw war and to not allow war to be used as a way of resolving disputes between states is a kind of foundational principle of the legal order. It's not just sort of one of many rules that you can kind of ignore once in a while and then kind of go back to it, and then kind of ignore it this time when it's sort of convenient and then go back to it. Like, it's the core principle it's a kind of the organizing principle of the world order. And it's, once you outlaw war, necessarily what follows from that is outlawing conquest. What follows from that is a crime of aggression. What follows from that is that economic sanctions are legal. There's lots of things that come with it that are intrinsic and valuable and key to the international legal system that we have. And chipping away at that core principle, as Scott rightly said, as both sides have at times been willing to do, and as many states have been willing to do, puts the whole thing at risk. And so, if I were to give a message to people who are listening to this, it would be, write your members of Congress that you care about these issues, that it matters when we are acting in ways that are violating the international legal rules around use of force, that we shouldn't be committing more troops to ongoing missions in Syria, that we shouldn't be threatening first strike in North Korea. That these things really matter deeply, and that politicians do need to hear from people that they care about them, because they then know that this is something that they can and should spend their time on. So that's another thing that I think is important for people to bear in mind, is that their views do count, and expressing those views can really matter.
That's excellent point. Scott, I see you nodding your head. Did you want to add something?
Oh, I just to say that I was nodding my head because, I was agreeing.
Yeah.
You see, it is the most unbelievable thing for us to like, because we didn't know about these people, and just to follow their story and how indefatigable they were, how dogged they were in pursuing this idea, and they didn't let. I mean, there were the stories that we learned about and we tell in the book of this one roadblock after another, and I will say, let me just read one thing, which is the beginning of the epilogue of the book, the conclusion, which to me was one of the to both of us was one of the most poignant things we had read in our research. It was Oona had found this letter that John Dewey, the great American philosopher and theorist of education, who was really good friends with Salmon Levinson, and he wrote to his second wife in November of 1940. Now, November of 1940, you have the Panzers rolling through Paris, and inconceivably, Europe descending for a second time into a global, into a world war. And Dewey wrote to his second wife describing Saul as the man who started the outlawry of war, poor man, though it will come to something sometime. And here's this man who he was cheated out of the Nobel Prize by Frank Kellogg, as we described in the book. It was a really terrible thing that Frank Kellogg did. He was somebody who, even after the Kellogg-Briand Pact was signed, he worked for disarmament. He continued his activism, and he dies at the end of 1940, just when things look like his entire life had been for naught. But in fact, it is the darkness before the dawn, when even as the war starts, the Internationalists, led by another person we talk about, Sumner Welles, the Undersecretary of State, convenes a group of people in the bowels of the State Department to try to figure out what should the peace look like even before the United States gets into war, and which is an amazing degree of foresight to think, we're right about to get into a war. What will peace look like, so that when we fight this war, we're fighting for something that we believe in and that will hopefully end this kind of scourge going forward. So, even when people think that they're not making a difference, they often are, and in the fullness of time, their actions and their efforts are not wasted.
You remind me, in excuse me, in the beginning of the book, your description of the signing of this document, it actually brought tears to my eyes. My heart just was like, oh yes, this is so beautiful. And there's I'm not going to dare quote the Latin because I've never studied Latin before. So the English translation, you say, if you want peace, prepare for peace. And that resonated very, very strongly, because, that's so obvious, and we've been building our military for so long. And so, I lived in Israel, Palestine for 9 years and was doing some grassroots peace work. And a very dear friend of mine who was a military, I forget what I think he was a major general, a general major. But he said to me, the real purpose of military is so that we can stand on the front lines and hold the space for the peace work to be done. Okay, we're not going to give this was said to me a number of years ago, where the Israeli-Palestinian situation was a little different, and I'm not looking to address that topic per se, but more about the role of military in an internationalist world. Do we still need the military? And does that sentence, the purpose of the military being to hold a space while peace occurs, does that resonate with you at all?
Well, I would just say, I mean, it pains me so much because we're talking on a day when both the Democrats and Republicans just voted to increase defense spending by what, $130 billion. What, I mean,
Yeah.
what, I mean, it's a painful spectacle,
Yeah.
to see. I mean, I personally am not a pacifist in the sense that I do believe that, you know, there are times that states are justified in defending themselves, but you know, self-defense in a very extremely limited way, with imminent threats, is a far cry from the endless war that has been going on for so long. I mean, I was speaking of emotional parts of the Kellogg-Briand Pact. For me, it's the ending where Aristide Briand says, at the very end of the ceremony, he says, "Peace is proclaimed, that is well, that is much, but it still remains to organize. That is the work of tomorrow." Mm-hmm. It is not enough just to outlaw war. You need internationalists and the Internationalists 2.0 to continue the work of organizing the peace, so that we can avoid this endless conflict around the world, and figure out ways of living without war.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'll just add to that I think that one thing that you find is that it's very attractive to solve problems with force. It seems simple sometimes, or at least it seems simpler to resolve disputes with force. And it can take longer and seem more complicated to resolve them diplomatically. But in the end, the diplomatic solutions tend to be longer lasting, more effective, and of course, don't involve bloodshed. And I think one of the real sad things about the current moment is the underinvestment in the State Department and the failure to have people in important diplomatic posts and to fund a lot of the State Department programs that are in place to make war less necessary. And to resolve disputes in a peaceful manner as opposed to using force to do so. And I think part of what's disappointing about the current moment is that we're investing a lot more in the Department of Defense, which obviously does need to be properly funded, but it's not clear that anyone who is paying attention really thinks that those investments are necessary, or at least the case has not really been effectively made that those investments are necessary to our defense. And meanwhile, we've been cutting back radically on State Department staff, that people have not been appointed to important posts, that important State Department programs have been underfunded or cut back. And that's just the wrong way to go about solving our problems right now. That really we should be investing more in diplomatic solutions and in rebuilding and in providing support to communities that otherwise might break out into war, rather than investing a lot more money in, you know, at least what have not been well justified military investment programs. And that, from my understanding, it's not really spending that the Department of Defense was demanding or it indicated was necessary, but that there are other reasons that there was a desire to spend a lot more money on the Department of Defense. So, you know, that's, I think, part of the reason that many of us are kind of frustrated by the current moment and concerned that the lesson of the Internationalists hasn't really been learned as well as it should have been, and that we're to some degree turning our back on the commitments and successes of the Internationalists, because they understood you had to build a set of institutions that would allow you to solve problems diplomatically, and they invested in creating the United Nations and the tools of the United Nations and a place where states could come together and talk about their disputes and resolve them collectively. And you know, we have not been using that as robustly as we should. And by investing so much in military tools, we may be at the same time underinvesting in other ways that we can resolve those disputes, and pulling back from UN programs and the like that really have been proven to be quite successful in averting catastrophes. So that to me is a worrisome sign that some of the lessons of the internationalists have been forgotten. And part of what we want to do is encourage people to pay attention to the successes that they had and the arguments that they made, and realize that it was that creating a system based on resolving disputes diplomatically rather than through force is first of all not foreordained. There's no guarantee it'll always be that way, and that we have to continue to work at it, that it doesn't just continue to exist without our continuing to invest in it. We're worried that we haven't been investing enough in that vision.
So, first thing I think is that we need to be sending a copy of your book to every single leader in government and any hopeful for government, especially because we have so many more women starting to run now, that it gives a very solid international basis for how to move forward, or ideas for moving forward. And so my next question for you too would be, if you could wave a magic wand and take everything that you have learned from the writing of this book and serve as advisors to leadership across the world, what would you tell them to do? What direction would you encourage them to go? I know this is kind of a big question, but I would imagine this has caused you to think quite a lot about what you've learned and the implications of today.
I can say just a few brief words about that. I mean, I would say to invest more in tools for resolving disputes diplomatically, to reinvest in the UN. I think the UN has a lot of promise. It is sometimes quite frustrating, and it's understandable why countries sometimes feel like it's not as effective a place for resolving disputes as they would like. But, it is a place where 193 nations can come together peacefully to talk about the areas in which they disagree. It has been successful over the years in averting a lot of international catastrophes. Would invest more in peacekeeping, which had been built over the course of the last several decades and was pretty successful in helping to avert civil wars in places that had become quite unstable. And then I think second, to look for ways to use economic sanctions as opposed to force to try and bring about diplomatic solutions. And there have been some really great examples of this. One great example of this is when it was clear that Iran was developing a nuclear capacity that was threatening to the United States, the Obama administration took steps, collectively working with the United Nations, to really step up economic sanctions against Iran and design sanctions that basically closed off all of the banking system of Iran from the international banking system. Basically, effectively what they said is you can either do business with US banks and European banks or with Iranian banks, but not with both. Choose. And of course, everybody chose to work with European and American banks, not with the Iranian banks. And that really closed off the Iranian economy from the rest of the world. And brought Iran to the negotiating table, where they agreed to end enrichment to the level that's necessary to weaponize uranium, that they agreed to get rid of several or to decommission several of their plants that were playing an important role in creating nuclear weapons. And, that there was a diplomatically resolved solution to that problem. Now, there are lots of critiques of it, and it's not perfect, but it was a lot better than bombing those sites, which was the main alternative, and which had been used in the past, but not very successfully, where nuclear enrichment site had been bombed by the Israelis and had set it back maybe a year. but not really particularly successful in terms of redirecting the Iranians from their effort to try and obtain nuclear weapons. So that it takes time, it takes a lot of effort, it takes coordination with the rest of the world, because sanctions are only really effective if you get lots of other states on board. It takes getting the UN on board, because the UN was significant to ensuring sanctions were effective. These were really carefully constructed programs for using the tools that the internationalists provided, the United Nations, economic sanctions, diplomacy, rather than the tools that the internationalists had rejected, that is force and blowing things up, which is the main alternative and would have been the way in which these kinds of problems would have been resolved before 1928. And so that's the kind of solutions we need. That's the kind of creative thinking we need. That's the kind of long-term planning we need. And that's a kind of coordination across lots of nations working together to try and resolve these disputes that are essential. It's not a quick fix. It's not super easy. It's not pushing a button and the problem's solved. But in the long term, it can be much more effective than blowing things up. And it doesn't lead to the kind of chaos and destruction that using military force instead often can lead to, which leads to additional problems. I mean, this is the problem with our invasion of Iraq. To address what we thought were weapons of mass destruction. Turned out there weren't any, and destroying the central government in Iraq ended up unleashing all kinds of chaos in Iraq, including Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which became modern day ISIS, which then took over much of the Middle East. So, using military force can have all kinds of unintended consequences we don't adequately appreciate, whereas using diplomacy rarely has the same kind of catastrophic unintended consequences. So that's the main message I would give is learn the lessons of the internationalists, use the tools of diplomacy and sanctions and what we call outcasting tools, rather than turning to what seemed like the quick fix of military force, which usually isn't all that quick and isn't all that much of a fix. And often, in the end can be counterproductive to the goals that they're trying to seek.
Can I let me just add one thing?
Of course.
That's just that, it's a weird way to put the point, but I think in some sense the main challenge for states is how do they live without war? How do they solve their problems with one another and discipline each other for violating the rules without war? And so, as Oona mentioned, the main way that has been developed in the post-war world is economic sanctions and denying people the benefits of trade and economic cooperation. So there's a way in which, and this was very self-conscious among the internationalists, that they wanted to develop a system of free trade as a way of giving people a substitute for war, both in the sense that they could make money through trade instead of conquest, but also that they could exclude people from cooperation if they were bad actors. Now, there's, as we know, free trade has gotten a very bad name in the last few years. The backlash against NAFTA, the backlash against TPP, which was killed by the Trump administration, though the Hillary Clinton's campaign also committed to kill TPP. The problem is not free trade per se. It's the fact that states have been unwilling to take the benefits, the surplus created by free trade, and spread it more evenly. So in many ways, if I had to wave a magic wand, I would say, please create policies which combat income inequality. Because what you're doing is you're creating populations who have lost out through globalization and through free trade, and are turning against free trade And when you turn against free trade, you're getting rid of one of the main mechanisms that we have for avoiding war.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, it's not free trade per se, it's the inability and the unwillingness of states to spread the wealth more equally. And things are, as we all know, things are just getting worse. More and more of the benefits of globalization are going to the top earners and less going to everyone else. And this is a really unstable and bad way to run the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I think of somewhere I was just quickly looking through, because my Kindle notes here. As far as at one point, when I was reading, I thought, and so are you suggesting that a free market or a capitalist system is a better way to go? Because that is a term, at least in a more progressive, politically progressive circles, that say, you know, we have to end free trade and capitalism in order to make peace. And so I thought that was an interesting, healthy tension dynamic that you address in the book in various forms.
Right.
I just add to what Scott said, that's, you know, I think you're right that sometimes people think that free trade is a problem. And part of the argument that we try to make is free trade is actually a key to the solution. And that you have to have other ways of influencing states, and you have to be economically intertwined with other states for economic sanctions to work, and that its cooperation and collaboration is essential to an effective and thriving global legal order, and part of that is cooperation and collaboration around economics. I think part of the problem is, as Scott has said, is that what too often has happened is that the benefits from free trade have been too tightly concentrated on a small number of people, and the people who are hurt are also, it's a concentrated population. The people whose jobs are lost to competition, the people whose jobs are lost because certain industries leave and go elsewhere, and they don't feel that they can adequately retrain to get jobs in the modern economy. And that's a problem, I think, that both the left and the right have largely ignored. Truthfully, I think even the left, which speaks more about this issue or has traditionally spoken more about this issue, hasn't really adequately addressed it. And you know, that's a big mistake, and that's one of the things that does need to be corrected. But it's not free trade that's a problem. It's the way in which we have dealt with the effects of free trade on our economy and on real people and on communities. That's the problem, and that's what needs to be addressed.
Oh, excellent. Well, so I see we're just about 2 minutes left of our hour time together. Is there any major takeaway? I mean, that you feel? Well, actually, let me ask this a little differently. Do you feel, how is writing this book? I mean, this is a little bit of a longer conversation. I'm trying to make it a little bit short, but what's your takeaway? How has it changed your life? That's a very big question. So, but has it made you more positive towards what's possible? Maybe I'll ask it like that.
I would say it both makes me more positive towards what's possible, in that we saw the Internationalists kind of working against all odds to really transform the world in a positive way, and making possible much of what today we take for granted, that we live in a world where war is not legal, and where interstate wars, that is wars between states, are much less common than they once were. I think it's also made me realize how fragile that is. While there's a hopeful note, there's also a cautionary note. That is, we have to be careful not to put what they succeeded in bringing about at risk. And if we value the peaceful world order that we have enjoyed thanks to the Internationalists, we have to work hard to preserve it. And we can't just sit on our laurels and assume someone else will do it for us.
Mm-hmm.
I just add one very small thing is that absolutely to say one of the great things about writing the book is that we've gotten to know, about organizations like the Charter for Compassion, people like you, Mimi, and Marilyn, and anti-war activists, and this community of activists who are fighting the good fight, and that's been really inspiring for us.
Isn't it? You just make me laugh. I was thinking about this earlier. Isn't it funny? Even in our language, we fight the good fight. You know, I mean, it's like this how our language is we're still working our way through the war on drugs, the war on this, the war on that, and so may we continue to persevere for goodness. And and thank you both so much for your time. And for those who have not had a chance to read this excellent inspirational book, I really encourage it, and I encourage you also to send it to your public officials and leaders so we can get the world moving back into a direction of care, peace, and compassion. And Oona and Scott, thank you so much for your time. And for those who are participating and watching, not only read the book, but if you want to check out charterforcompassion.org, we'd love your input, feedback. We'd love for you to become members to support the Internationalists 2.0 compassionate movement. And thank you. Okay. Take care, everyone. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.